finally succumbed and came up with this title, My Life and Loves, Adventures with Books and Booksellers, highly enjoyable and often successful, with women, entertaining but a non-starter for this environment, and with my epiphanies du jour, invariably disastrous. In all, a merry talk for a merry evening. I must say that while I've given a number of talks on books, asset recovery, adventures in Bougainville, a business venture that dissolved into a disaster that continues to this day, and I mean today also, and even a talk on women, this, however, to a very different audience. My talk today has been beset with vexatious thoughts that have plagued me almost on a daily basis. The adventures of Mr. Donald Trump. My approach to this continuing cataclysm has been to retreat to the classics, not Plato or Aristotle or Augustine, but rather Rosenbach, McGee, Jenkins, Lewis, and the like. These are my heroes. And sitting at the top of this pile, in a world by himself, is Abraham Simon Wolfe Rosenbach, a Philadelphia boy, by the way. To try to give you some idea of the impact Rosenbach has had on me ever since I read Edwin Wolfe's wonderful 1960 biography, I offer the following. About 40 years ago, I attended a concert at Carnegie Hall. The program was Bach's B minor Mass, the most sublime piece of music I have ever heard. There was a comment in the program, Notes, that carried a headline, Notes on Bach. It was written by Lewis Thomas, a noted physician and author. I tore it out and have kept it with me all these years. Let us assume, he wrote, that there is indeed sentient life in one or another part of the remote space, and that we will be successful in getting in touch with it. What on earth are we going to talk about? We could begin by gambling on the rightness of our technology and just send out news of ourselves like a mimeographed Christmas letter. But we would have to choose our items carefully, with durability and meaning in mind. Perhaps the safest thing to do at the outset, if technology permits, is to send music. This language may be the best we have for explaining what we are to others in space, with least ambiguity. I would vote for Bach, all of Bach, streamed out into space over and over again. We would be bragging, of course, but it surely is excusable for us to put on the best possible face at the beginning of such an acquaintance. Rosie is my Bach. It was the first book I picked up the day after the election, and it sits at my night table with another copy in my apartment in New York and still a third copy in my office. I don't believe I can give you an accurate idea of just how well known he was. I mean, stories of his feats at auctions in both the States and England made front page news. He really was a rock star and had the credentials to back his play. I would guess that a goodly number of you in the audience have at least a passing knowledge of the man, and those who are local might want to take time to visit Rosenbach Foundation, which houses his personal collection. Now, booksellers' collections are not necessarily book collectors' collections. One day, some years ago, you know, you go around the track enough times, you forget what you thought happened 6 years ago, happened 36 years ago. Well, somewhere in that time frame, some years ago, I was talking with a noted bookseller, Nico Israel, who was at the time the eminence grise of the Dutch book trade. And he commented, Michael, we booksellers are right half the time. The other half we call inventory. I suppose a number of the books at Rosenbach Foundation fall into this category, but there are gems that he chose to keep, like a Bay Psalm book. How he got this little book is recounted in Woolf's biography. It's interesting to ask book collectors how and when they started collecting books. Quite often you will learn it's an evolutionary process, and it rarely transcends generations. It seems that at any level, from collecting the highest and rarest to the most common books, there is a relationship between the collector and the book that is complete and of a whole. The collector needs no further satisfaction or approbation, and rarely seeks it from other collectors, being completely of a one with his books. When you ask a collector how he started with the books, you learn that he often first collected coins or stamps. Both these areas, and books too, have been displaced by competing demands of time on prospective collectors today. My own experience is telling. I collected stamps and then moved into collecting books and prints. This due to the singular circumstance made available to me in the form of a relative who had escaped the Nazis, came to America and became a rare book dealer. More to the point, he lived 2 blocks from my home, and I had easy access to him and his books. That said, later on in my collecting life, I looked at the treasures I purchased as a teenager. There was not a single book that I bought that had any value, as opposed to several prints that turned out to be Rembrandts and Dürers. All fell in the $10 per week category of available funds, and when I did sell some of the prints, the return was in the hundreds and thousands of dollars. Of the books, nada. I still have 1 or 2 of them from this period, and their value rests more in the weight of the paper than on the words printed in them. I was probably 20 or 21 when I purchased my first important book in the book world. It was a copy of the octavo edition of Audubon's Quadrupeds of North America. And I bought it from a dealer in New York, Michael Papantonio, for $200. As I came with a reference from my cousin, he offered to let me take the volumes and pay for them over time. But I was reluctant to do this, and so would come over to his office every week and give him $5 or $10. It was on 45th Street in New York, I think west of 5th Avenue. And I would pay him that amount, and when I hit the $200, I took the book home, and I remembered how proud I was at the time. I treasured the volumes until one day I had a chance to sell them for $1,500. It wasn't even a close call. The coyote response applies to books as well as women. You fall in love, but upon waking up the next morning with your arm under the girl's neck, you choose to gnaw it off at the shoulder rather than awaken her. What prompted the initial purchase of the books was a chance encounter at a local picture frame dealer who happened to have quite a number of the folio prints of the quadrupeds. In this case, they referred to the lesser animals, rats and the like. No one had seemed to want them, and I bought probably 40 or 50 of them for about $6 a piece, picking them up 3 or 4 at a time as I had my money to spend. My interest in Audubon became quite consuming, and I eventually came to own copies of the folio edition of the quadrupeds, several copies of the folio American edition of the Birds of America, and 9 or 10 of the original oil paintings of the animals, including the grizzly bear and deer. At the beginning of this quest, I took the New York City Yellow Pages. I suppose some of the younger audience can learn what these were if they ask anyone over 50, and went down the list of members of the American Antiquarian Society, Booksellers Society, asking if they had anything on the list asking them if they had anything about Audubon, which is where I picked up the volumes from Papantonio. Another dealer on the list was a gentleman named Irving Zucker. I could probably talk about Irving for the entire period of time allotted to me, but suffice it to say, my initial conversation, which I remember to this day, went something like this. Me: Mr. Zucker, my name is Michael Zinman. I'm interested in knowing if you have anything by John James Audubon or his sons. Irving: Who gave you my name? Literally, he snarled it. I wrote down snarled it. But I can't share with you this nuance of this wonderfully flavored response. He did have a couple of volumes, which I bought for about $75, and he subsequently became one of my closest friends in the business. Irving was a remarkable man, uneducated. I believe he went to high school, but certainly did not graduate. He started off truly with nothing, delivering books from one dealer to another on 4th Avenue in New York City, and started along the way to buy the odd volume, selling it onward in the same universe. He eventually became a leading dealer in modern graphic books, the likes of Matisse, Picasso, Klee, and others. He had an innate sense of the beauty of them and an unerring sense of their value. Bill Reese is the new Rosenbach. I met him at a disastrous book fair in Chicago some 40 years ago and have followed his career ever since. There are a handful of other dealers that operate in this world, Clarence Wolfe being one of them, but he set out from Yale with a specific goal to be the greatest bookseller in America. He has achieved this goal and continues to milk the minds and pocketbooks of both the rich and famous, and also a very democratic population of collectors who are happy to spend hundreds with him rather than hundreds of thousands. Picture him sitting back in his chair, I would guess, completely satisfied. If he were a smoking man, as Rosie was, he would have a Havana in his mouth, embargoes be damned. Early on in his career, he got to know John Holmes Jenkins. Johnny was probably the only rock star in the business after Rosenbach and before Reese. He engineered the purchase of the holdings of the Eberstadt brothers, who were the leading dealers in the field of Western Americana, which includes the Republic of Texas. Forget state. When you're down there, this is pointed out, whether you're interested or not. Johnny was able to get a great deal of publicity and mileage out of this purchase, and when it arrived in his warehouse in Austin, complete with armored escort, the pirates of the industry, or better put, happy vultures, descended on Austin to reap their just, in their opinion, rewards. One of them was Warren Howell, a leading and rather imperious dealer in San Francisco. The story I got from one of the dealers there was that Warren went into one of the areas of the warehouse where the books had been unloaded and pulled out a number of them to buy. He brought them up to Johnny and asked the price of one particular book. Johnny said, 10 grand. Warren said, can you do a little better? Without batting an eye, Johnny said 12.5. Warren paid the 12.5. I wasn't there, but I got the story from someone directly who was. Johnny had a puckish way about him, and on another occasion, he set up another Texas dealer, Ray Walton. There's something about Texas dealers. I once bought what is considered to be E. E. Cummings' masterpiece, painting, not poem, entitled New York 1927. I saw this at a bookstore in Austin and bought it for $2,500, thinking I could do no wrong. That was probably 30 years ago. I like it, but my wife relegated it to one of our bathrooms in Palm Beach, and when we closed that place, she would not permit it back into the house. I had it shipped to my office and hung it proudly in the lobby. The female staff took considerable exception to it. Now remember, it's E. Cummings' masterpiece, but it's a full-size painting of his wife wearing red hat and red shoes. That's it. I refused to move it, you know, Rana Senor stuff. but I was ambushed one day when I found a large marketing poster our company used in a display placed in front of it. We are at a Mexican standoff. I won't take it down, and they won't move the poster. To demonstrate my prowess in art collecting, I've tried to sell the painting for the last 20 years with no takers, and price was not the deciding factor. As I was saying before this digression, I want to tell you about what Johnny did to Ray. One day when he was at Johnny's, Johnny had one of his cohorts go to the back and come out with a nondescript book of absolutely no value. He asked Johnny how much he would take for it, and Johnny said something like $250, but he wouldn't sell it because he was keeping it for his title collection. The cohort asked Johnny how much would he sell it for without the title. Johnny said $150. With that, the cohort ripped the title page out of the book, gave it to Johnny with his $150, and walked out of the store. Ray, to his death, refused to accept the fact that he was taken. And another Texas story got added to the pile. Some years later, I saw a stack of books sitting in front of a local bookstore in Dobbs Ferry, New York, and got the idea of doing a leaf book of title pages for Johnny. I ripped out about 40 or 50, gave them to Bill Reese, and we Xeroxed the title pages and had printed an edition of 20 or 25 copies. The book was called The Immense and Distinguished Half-Title Collection of John H. Jenkins III, Esquire of Austin, Texas, now elucidated. It's a collector's item today, and I have to go back. It was the half titles that we were collecting, not the title. I'll change it. Early on in my career, having graduated from collecting books on the discovery of the New World and subsequent events in the 16th century, and entering into the world of the history of printing in North America, I got quite interested in a subset of these works, almanacs. They really were both interesting and, if you took the time, held some wise and at other times hilarious stories. One thing I observed was that lawyers in the 18th century were held in the same regard as they are today. There were so many anecdotes that permeated the almanacs that my son, who at the time was a student at New York University School of Law, collected them and published them in the New York Law Journal. I don't remember many of them now, but one always stuck in my mind. It was headed, Tombstone of a Lawyer. And the almanac author wrote, God works wonders now and then. Here lies a lawyer, an honest man. This is all prelude to an idea I got one day. I let it be known that I would buy any 19th century almanac tendered for $1 each. Little I know how many booksellers were waiting for this fool to show up. I even made it easier for them. I told them, just send them to me with what they had with an invoice. After maybe 6 or 7 weeks, I had to turn the spigot off. I really was overwhelmed. 350 almanacs, 1,100 almanacs, 800 almanacs, they kept coming in. When I stopped, I had something like 25 or 30 banker's boxes full of them. And not wanting to face up to my foolishness and not capable of using them for kindling, I stuck them in a corner of my warehouse and forgot them. We moved our office a couple of years ago, and the almanacs came to light. What to do? You see, I have this deal with a library company. I send them stuff, and they promise not to send it back. In this case, I did send them down, and they cataloged them, or more properly separated them and counted them. There were about 7,000 of them, but I just heard there were more. And what is being done with them is the library company's problem, no longer mine. Another brilliant adventure has the beauty of being on top of K2, the second tallest mountain in the world, and then waking up a little later to discover that you could have been on top of Everest, but for one's inherent talent for disaster. As you all most likely are aware, the Federalist is one of the touchstones of those that can, those that can do, those that can't teach, esteemed libertarians of our great nation. I've owned several copies of the work over the years, but want to tell you about two of them. Several years ago, one of the local book scouts came into my office with a box of books. In the box was a copy of Volume 1 of the deluxe edition of the Federalist. It contained a wonderful inscription that read, "James Morey, given to me by Mr. Madison, one of the supposed authors." The dealer knew it was a valuable book, probably the most valuable he ever owned, and when I asked him how much he wanted for it, he replied, $25,000. I bought it, of course, not only for its rarity and value, but also because I happened to have on my bookshelf a Volume 2 of the work, also on thick paper, and for which I was waiting to find a Volume 1 for some 30 or 40 years. Questioning the runner as to how he came by the volume, the others in the box were of little or no value, he said that a friend of his was cleaning out a house, and there were some books in it, so he went over and bought the books. When I asked if Volume 2 of the set might still be at the house, he said that the person he bought these from had taken several boxes of books to the local thrift shop, and he felt they were of no value whatsoever. I suggested maybe this runner might want to go over to the thrift shop and see if Volume 2 was there, and in the course of a few days, he came back to the office with the precious little volume in his hand. It too had the inscription from Morey indicating that Madison gave him the book. We quickly settled on a price for the second volume, and I put it on my shelf together once again with Volume 1. Now, the Federalist is a very expensive book today, selling at prices from $150,000 to $450,000. The copy at the exalted level being one in original condition as issued, that is, being in a copy in original boards, unbound, and with an ownership inscription of some notable person, an important association copy of the book. However, because the authors, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, chose to present the papers as a unity, they wrote under the name Publius and never owned up to authorship at the time, although it was well known in political circles who were the writers of the articles. As a matter of fact, the first public indication of authorship was in an edition of the work published in 1810. In 1818, a Washington publisher, Jacob Gideon Jr., prepared to publish another edition and contacted Madison to ask him to identify the author of each of the essays. Madison complied and sent the necessary information to Gideon, and this edition is really the first one that has the author's name attached to each essay. The point I'm trying to make is that there are no known presentation copies of the work where one of the authors inscribed the book itself and presented to one of his friends or associates. A copy of the Federalist, now at Williams College, has the ownership signature of George Washington. It's pretty reasonable to believe that it was a presentation copy, and this is reinforced by a letter from Hamilton to Washington telling him the book was being sent to him. But there's a fly in the ointment. It's known that Washington ordered 4 more copies of the book, and whether this particular copy, now at Williams, is the one that Hamilton sent, rather than the ones Washington purchased himself, cannot be established 100%. I would bet it is, but it still bears no imprimatur of Hamilton. Incidentally, the volume, when it sold at Sotheby's, brought $1.4 million. Of course, there must have been many copies sent out by the authors, but only 2 survived with a presentation in any fashion, each being an inscription in the volumes in the hand of the recipient. One is here at the Library Company, as a matter of fact. It was given by Hamilton. It was given by Hamilton to William Bingham, a prominent Philadelphia merchant, and reads, "The gift of the author, Colonel Hamilton, to his friend William Bingham." The other is in my collection, as I have described. Maury, by the way, was a very close friend of Madison and was the first American consul and was stationed at Liverpool, England, where the first consulate was set up. All this is prelude. As you can realize, my copy of the Federalist is really quite valuable. But if a copy were to be found annotated or presented by one of the authors, it would probably bring almost as much money as the Washington copy. There is a black tulip in this flower bed. Among Madison's letters in the Library of Congress is one he wrote Gideon in 1818 to assist him in his printing of his 1818 edition. It reads in part, "I have received your letter of the 19th, and in consequence of the request it makes, I send you a copy of the first edition of the Federalist, with the names of the writers prefixed to their respective numbers. Not being on the spot, when it was in the press, the errors noted in mine were not then corrected. You will be so good as to return the 2 volumes when convenient to you." As I mentioned before, over the years I've had a number of copies of the Federalist. Sometimes volume 1 only, sometimes volume 2 only, sometimes the complete set. I've never been a fastidious collector, and in many cases have purchased incomplete copies of works. I once described this as the critical mess of collecting. One of the defective copies I acquired probably 40 years ago was a copy of the deluxe edition of volume 2 on thick paper and in the original binding. It had the names of the authors of each essay written beside each essay, which were then written in a contemporary hand. I never really gave this a moment's thought other than to take a mental note of this. However, as the volume was incomplete, when I received it, and as I had another copy of volume 2 on my shelf at the time, I gave away leaves to any and all who asked for them. Pieces of the true cross, as they say. I do have some 10 or so leaves left. I have been doing some digging recently and wandering copies of the Federalist, which is how the Madison letter surfaced, and comparing the handwriting in one of the essays of my fragment, I learned that, both to my delight and abysmal regret, I had the copy of volume 2 that Madison sent to Gideon. It's sort of like Hemingway's Fisherman. He had a great fish to start with, but when he finally came to shore, all that were left were the bones. The amusing thing about all this is that I really delight in my misadventure and truly have no pangs of regret over my brilliant gifts. I really mean it. It will warm my heart, if not my purse, when I get around to thinking about these stories in my winter of content. A final note. I want to take the time to acknowledge and thank our President of the Board of Trustees, Hal Rosenberg. Without his wise support, this talk would not have been given. Thank you.